Hi, I'm Davis. This is Production 101. So just a little scope of what we're kind of going to be talking about. We're going to walk through kind of harvest in the cellar from start to finish, talking about crush, maceration, pressing, go into it, tasting. We're going to talk about fermentation, barrels, other things that are kind of considered in the whole production process. We're going to start where we left off, which is considering what's kind of going on in the grape. Not every grape is the same, but on the inside, it all is the same color, same pulp, same different seed numbers depending on germination in the vineyard. But when we're thinking about a wine, think about something like Nebbiolo, which is sometimes quite light in color, and then you go thinking about a grape variety like Cabernet Sauvignon, very dark in color. That color comes from the thickness of the skin and the pigment of the skin, not from what is on the inside. And then we're thinking about some things about how long the juice is on the skins, and that's kind of like steeping a tea, as it were. We'll talk about that in a second, but just thinking about a grape on its own right now is kind of the foundation to how it turns into a wine. We left off talking about berry sampling in the vineyard, and that being kind of the scope for when winemaker's like, okay, we're going to pick these grapes, they're ready to rock. The sugar is exactly where I want it against the acid. We're thinking about something called bricks. That's what we spoke about last time. We're talking about a balance there against something also called phenolic ripeness. Thinking about the ripeness of these seeds, whether or not they're ready to go, whether they have had enough time to turn into the texture that we're going to want against some of the other things in a grape, thinking about the tannin and the pigmentation of the skin, whether or not that's reached its ideal ripeness. All right, this is a fun little picture. So we're starting here on what's called the crush pad. It's typically either like under a shed outside, and it's just when the grapes are being brought in what's called a ton bin. If you see over here, these are kind of like these giant baskets or buckets that you dump all the grapes in the vineyard when they're ready to go, and then they're hauled into the cellar in these giant bins. Those bins are then taken and dumped into, I guess, an assembly line, as it were. And we're kind of focusing on the first half of what happens in the production side of a cellar here. The grapes are going to leave the vineyard. They're going to hit the crush pad. It's the welcome spot, as it were. Crush is essentially the process of taking the grapes from the bins and putting them into a processable fruit, because we're not just taking the grapes and throwing them into a vat most of the time. And then we're talking about maceration, which is what happens after the crush pad and kind of going into the fermentation process. We're thinking about things called destemming, so literally ripping the grapes off of the rachis, off of their stems, if that's a decision that's wanted to be made. That's why there are asterisks there. It's kind of optional. For white wines, they're going right into pressing after being sorted, so after we're taking all of the lizards or leaves or snakes or frogs. These are all things that I've seen while sorting grapes, and then you put them into the vats, and we'll talk about that in a second. White wines are pressed immediately, and they're kind of treated a little bit differently. I have a diagram to show that in a moment. There is another thing that winemakers can decide right now, which is something called cold soaking. I mentioned it a little later on, but it's essentially another one of those tools that a winemaker can do to affect the expression of the wine in one way or another. But again, I'll talk about that in a minute. We're talking about extraction here. We're talking about timing. The idea here is to take the skins of those red grapes, in this case, sometimes orange wine's a little different, and for white grapes, that is. And we're making a decision of how long we want the juice to sit with the skins. so as to take out as much identity that is found with the skins. That is to say, the color, the tannin, and that's why phenolic ripeness matters so much when making your berry picking decisions. Then, last but not least, we're going into fermentation, which most often for red wines happens in a vat and then gets pressed, whereas white wines, they are pressed and then fermented. That looks like this for white wines. You have your harvest, then they're pressed immediately. That first arrow between harvest and pressed is where that sorting happens that I mentioned. Then from that pressed wine, you're going into a vat. Little tricky here because not all white wines are treated the same. White wines can start fermentation in the vat and then go into a barrel or a clay pot, we call that amphora, or cement. Sometimes I've seen it in a glass orb too, and winemakers love playing with the orb. And then you can do a secondary fermentation in the barrel. We see that most often with wines that we're familiar with, like from Burgundy or California, with Chardonnay specifically. Sometimes you see that with Sauvignon Blanc. A couple of good options there. Next, you go straight into the filtering process, into the bottling process, and then you're good to pop. An important thing to note here is something that shocked me a little bit. When you're getting your white grapes in from a vineyard, you're putting them into the press and then into a tank, but you don't want fermentation to start all the time at that point. So you're going to intentionally cool down the wines in that tank. Every tank, for the most part, has something called a glycol unit, which is like a flowing cooling system or heating system. It allows you to regulate the temperature as if you were putting something on the stove or in an oven, and you're able to control what is going on in the wine. This is really important because when we're thinking about fermentation, we're thinking about something that is highly temperature sensitive. We'll talk about that in a minute, but keep that in the back of your mind because this is giving the winemaker a large amount of control. When we were talking about viticulture a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about all of the tools viticulturists can use to impact grape expression. These are the tools that a winemaker has to take that foundation, that is the grapes, and then affect the final product, that is the wine that they're intending to make. That's the style of the house, it's the identity of place, trying to capture it as best as possible. Sometimes slowing down that fermentation and stopping it immediately is really helpful insofar as being able to put it in the right barrel. I'll talk about that in a minute. Red wine, there's one caveat. You remember me raking and bleeding with that rake. That's what's happening in that top right corner for you guys. That's the crush process. It's where you're sorting everything. White wines don't really go through that as much in such a meticulous way. Then the crushed grapes, once they leave crush pad and they go into a bin or a vat, they then start fermentation always in a tank for the most part. Could be another receptacle like a bin, but that's kind of like natty wine world. But I have made wine in a bin before. Fermentation will start there. After fermentation happens, you press the wine. It could go into a barrel or another steel tank, and then after it's aged for the allotted amount of time, you go into bottling. There are some pretty unique caveats here, though, that I'm really excited to share with you because this is how we're going to talk about that extraction conversation that I started a minute ago. A quick little video here. This is essentially what the whole sorting process looks like. You're literally sweeping through bushels of grapes. Your hands get sticky. The acid is sneaky here because it starts to cut up your hands. And you're essentially taking out everything that we call the mog, or just like random organic matter, but also taking out things like snakes and lizards, which is wild to think about. It's also where you're particular about the grapes that you're picking. Sometimes the grape bundles or clusters don't come in an appreciated way. For example, sunburnt grapes is a really great example for California, and hot vintages Grapes might get really, really sunburnt on one side, and you don't really want that because it's going to turn into a final product that won't be as appreciated or maybe the style of what you're looking for. And the same thing goes for white grapes. Especially because with white grapes, you're, for the most part, not destemming before you're pressing. This is a really important thing to consider because if you have too much stem in your press, you're going to get a lot of tannin going in, or phenolics in this case, going into your final wine. And that phenolic identity can be really divisive if you're not sorting your grapes cleanly. Think about it if you had like too many leaves in a tea that you're steeping. You don't really want to have too much because everything's about balance. It's going to be out of sorts, and it's not going to be the desired product that's true to the fruit itself. I wanted to do a quick cul-de-sac here, which is talking about orange wine. This is more of like a production 201 snapshot, but you know, it's kind of one of those exceptions that we're talking about when I mention, you know, white wine goes straight from sorting to press and then to fermentation. In the case of orange wine, you actually do let the wine sit on the skins for a little while. The idea there is to bring out a little bit of, like, to steep your tea a little more. It's a really good example, one-to-one. But the idea here is to bring kind of that more aromatic herbaceousness and texture to a wine rather than it just being straight juice that's going into fermentation. So now we're talking about kind of the bread and butter of red wine making. We're talking about maceration styles. There are a couple things happening in this in these few photos. Does anybody know what any of these styles are? Lucas doesn't have to answer because I know he knows. So on the far right side, this giant pole actually has a giant flat piece of steel on the end of it, and it's used for punch downs. The best workout I've ever gotten in my life. You can see me doing one there. The idea here is to take the cap that forms on top of your fermentation, which starts right about there, and then all the juice is underneath there. What you're doing at that point, when you're punching down, is taking all of the grapes from the top of the tank, literally pushing it to the bottom of the tank, and you're getting as much extraction as you possibly can out of the grapes themselves. Literally beating the heck out of them with the intention of pulling out as much identity from the skins and popping as many berries. You're getting more juice, you're getting more extraction. But that's a pretty violent way of pushing the juice on top of the skins. It's really intense. It's very different than what this is. This is called a pump over. Pump overs are a really gentle way of getting extraction out of your grapes. In fact, different winemakers prefer to do different styles of pump overs. For something like this, which is Cabernet Sauvignon, you desire to get a lot of extraction out of that grape. Whereas something like Pinot Noir here, you're not looking for really, really hard extraction for the most part. You're actually looking for really gentle extraction. The idea there is to have that candied, fruity, aromatic identity. Whereas with punch downs, you're going for texture. It's all about texture. And there are actually different ways of pumping over too. This is a style of pumping over that's excruciatingly gentle, but when it comes to Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, things like that, you can do something called the fire hose method. It sounds not technical, but it is. You essentially take a pipe and you flow all of the juice through a pump out of the bottom of your tank, and you then spray it like a fire hose on top of the cap so as to get as much extraction without punching the grapes. The idea there, again, is to add in the aromatic, fruity identity rather than to be pushing the grapes down and beating the heck out of them to get tannin extraction. That is to say, we're talking about a difference between texture and profile and fruit profile. That is really leading to what we call body. And the last part I'll add here is thinking about how long we're letting something ferment. The last part of body, and maybe this is another education class down the line, but you're talking about kind of a trifecta of tannin, acid, and alcohol, or profile, acid, and alcohol. That balance there is all started here with the intention of creating as much balance relative to your place, your winemaking style, and your grape varieties. Last but not least here, I'll also point out two different mediums through which we're kind of letting the wine ferment. Here you can see a steel tank, and there you see a barrel. That's a very large barrel called a puncheon, typically open top, and its idea is to have more surface area hitting your wine, and in this case, it's neutral oak, which is going to be imparting a little bit of a different character than steel. Neutral oak typically is not as heavy as new oak. I'll talk about that in a second, but the idea there is you're getting a little more aeration on the wine. You're speeding up fermentation actually quite a bit, because with fermentation, as I'll talk about in a second, we're talking about a pretty delicate equation of sugar, yeast, and carbon dioxide and alcohol. But if oxygen gets into the equation, alcohol gets oxidized, and it all goes awry. But you can be really intentional with it if you're trying to speed up fermentation. And in that case, you might want to be playing with texture in oak. So if you remember the structure that we spoke about, we said we were going to ferment and then we were going to press. Fermentation has already happened. We're talking about typically red wines here. And as I mentioned a minute ago, we're going to start with the end in mind. Oxygen is the enemy here. You do not want as much oxygen as possible, because you're going to start oxidizing the alcohol. Everything has gone through fermentation. It's not really in the perfect, it is in the perfect spot to your desire, but if it's exposed to too much oxygen, then it's not going to be to desired. That's to say, you're starting with the end in mind here, and timing is everything. There are so many different things that you're considering here, and part of that starts with that different type of expression of a wine that you're going to get based off of how much you're extracting, how much you're pushing on the grapes. That's to say that once fermentation is done, the juice on the bottom is going to be what they call free run juice. It's going to be fruity, it's going to be expressive, aromatic, just poppy in a lot of ways. Whereas as you start to press the wine in what's called a basket press here, I'll talk about all of these in a minute, as you start pressing the wine, it's going to start expressing itself in a very, very different way. A mentor of mine at Diamond Creek once told me that as you start pushing on the grapes a little more, you're starting to rip the meat off the bones as much as you possibly can in terms of wine, and things become more, to use a Parker word, bony over time as opposed to unctuous. And that's really what we're considering when we're talking about skins, stems, and seeds. We still have grapes there. Grapes are being pressed, the stems, the seeds, the skins might still be there. And as you're pressing more and more and more, you're getting more and more extraction against the juice that is little remaining left over, and it starts to change as you press it more and more. But there are different types of presses. This is a basket press typically used for red wines, but then we can go to a bladder press, which is used typically for white wines. Bladder presses are something that we also see with cider production quite frequently here in America and other places in the world. Sometimes you use basket presses too for those, but the idea really here is starting with the end in mind. How much extraction, how hard are we going to press on these grapes? The idea here is you kind of have this big cylinder, and on the inside there is what they call a bladder. It's essentially a bag that you fill up with air from the outside, and then in this liminal space between the outside of the cylinder and the inside of the bag, all of your grapes go there, and you start pressing. It's really gentle. It looks pretty intense if you can think of this bladder like on the far right side, blowing up all the way. But the best part about this is you have full control over how much pressure you put on that bladder. And in that way, you also are essentially in complete control over the fruit expression, the tannin expression, the phenolic expression that you are finding from those grapes that are being pressed on, because you have control of the pressure. As I mentioned ago, that's all relative to the seeds, the skins, the stems that might be present in those grapes that you're pressing. So here I'm blonde again, and we're back with the basket press and what we call the birthday cake. The idea here is to be using a pneumatic press to push down on your grapes to get your different press cycles out here. I mentioned a minute ago that there were different phases. You can see in this middle picture the birthday cake is quite tall, whereas in the bottom right the birthday cake is quite low. There's a lot of juice left in here. You can still see the residual right in here. The idea there is that they didn't press the wine as hard, and therefore you're not going to get as much of a tannic, textural wine as much as something that's aromatic and fruit forward. Whereas on the far right, that birthday cake is pressed down as much as possible. You're getting as much texture as you possibly can out of those grapes. And that, again, is all about the style of the wine that you're trying to achieve. Also is relative to the grape varieties that you're working with. You seldom will see a Pinot Noir that is ever pressed as hard as those Cabernet Franc grapes in the bottom right there. The idea there is your final product. The wine that you're trying to make as a Pinot Noir typically is not going to be wanted to be so textural, tannic, all of that. There are other things that you can do, like stem inclusion, as I mentioned earlier, if you're wanting to include that herbaceousness, that textural quality, without beating the heck out of those grapes, so as to preserve the aromatic identity and that juiciness that we're looking for in Pinot Noir. Just an exception to everything we're talking about, I intentionally haven't included a lot about sparkling wines in this presentation because they go through a whole different process for production. But remember a minute ago I talked about something called free run juice? That's exactly what this diagram is showing right now. The cap is up top here. Those grapes we're going to press because there's still juice there that can add a lot of identity, as I just mentioned. But here we have the immediate juice, the free run. And it's what they call saignée. You essentially let the juice go all the way down and you leave the cap to bleed, saignée, blood, out of the tank on its own without pressing anything so as to not get as much texture. And then those wines will then probably go into a second fermentation. That is what leads way to a sparkling wine down the line. We'll talk about that in a 201 and in a champagne class that I have going on in a couple of months. But for now, we're going to do a tasting. We're only going to be doing this half of the tasting. That's for the class next week. I want you to pay attention first to the rosé here. What are we noticing in that wine? Yes. Anything else? Outside of the color, let's talk about texture, let's talk about aroma.
Higher acidity, tannic structure is not firmness. I get a taste of it. Not as firm as the red wine. More aromatic in the nose.
Potentially. A little more not fruit forward, maybe? What do we think about the second one?
Much more aromatic.
The intensity of like the deep red fruit character is much more pronounced.
Right, right. And on the palate, what do we feel? Same grape, two different presses, essentially. We're talking about a Nebbiolo here that has spent no more than 3 days on the skins, probably less considering how pale this wine is. and to me, it's like very mineral driven. It's bright, it's salty. The acid's still quite high, but let's remember that acid isn't really going to change in the process here. Acid starts with the berry itself and kind of remains consistent outside of some changes that you can do in the cellar with additions or different types of fermentation that I'm going to talk about in a second. But the idea really here is to be considering fruit and texture, aroma versus texture, and in that tension that we can find. I think that this is a really good foundation to start thinking about what's going on in the cellar, thinking about press cycles. Why do I bring that up? Because then you're going to find two different red wines down the line that are going to have very different expressions, even though it's the same vintage, maybe same producer, maybe it's just a different vineyard site, and they're going to press the wine very differently. It's going to give you a very different wine in your glass, even though it might be the same grape. The idea here essentially is to start breaking down barriers that we might have in our minds about a way a wine is, and stop putting things into buckets, and to realize that everything is very nebulous. Yeah?
Are they the same producer?
No, they are not. No, they are not. And not the same vintage either. But for the purposes of this tasting, I didn't think that was as important. So we're now going to be talking about that holy equation I was mentioning a minute ago, which is talking about fermentation. It's sugar, it's yeast, it produces alcohol and carbon dioxide. Temperature is everything here. With higher temperature, your fermentations get moved along quicker. With lower temperature, your fermentations slow down. And it's for that reason that winemakers are really particular about the temperature of their cellar, the temperature of their tanks. I've had a couple nightmares where the glycol unit breaks and your fermentation is supposed to be at 85 degrees. It spikes up to 95 degrees because in these chemical reactions, heat is one of the byproducts with CO2. And that creates pretty big issues because the fermentation is going to be going too quick against the amount of time that you're trying to extract on those skins. Everything, if you can't see, is all about balance as much as it was in the vineyard as it is in the cellar. Yeast is everything. There are a lot of arguments about whether or not people should be inoculating their wines with different yeasts. Essentially, we have our wine in the tank. The juice is there, the skins are there, things are popping, juice is coming out of the grapes. Should we add yeast? It's a big question about whether or not you're trying to create a snapshot of place, but even in that conversation, there are also disagreements about what's called ester releases. Different yeasts will produce different ester releases in your final product. And for that reason, there are some wineries that are adamant about only using the yeast that is ambient in their vineyards because it will create a particular ester release in their final product. And then there are some producers that are very particular about the yeast they'll inoculate with, or there are some large wine producers that are just going to throw generic yeast and have a very blanket wine that won't have a ton of identity because they're just going for quantity over an expression of place. There's a word that we often hear in the wine world, which is lees, and it's in the alcohol world writ large. Sometimes we see it in French, sur lie or sur lie. This is the precipitate of alcohol fermentation in a barrel or in a tank, and it kind of looks like sludge, mud. If you go to the beach and the tide's going out and you see wet sand, that's what lees look like. It's used up yeast, but it's really helpful because it is what is not just doing the fermentation, but it's also adding a lot of texture. I'll talk about that in a minute with what's going on in the barrel post-fermentation. The other thing to be considering here is oxygen. So we have alcohol, right? Alcohol is a volatile compound. If oxygen attacks it, it becomes oxidized. It's redox reactions. And to protect your wine from oxygen, you're pumping in CO2, SO2, sulfur dioxide. The idea there is no oxygen involved, that if you are over-sulfuring a wine During fermentation, it will get you that reductive style that you're looking for. And then there are some places that really intend to include a lot of oxygen so as to make it an oxidized style of wine. Sometimes that's even based off of the region that you're in the style of wine for that region. Thinking about very reductive wines, which is more of like a movement than I would say it's a regional thing. You see it popping up here and there, but then there are some places that love including oxidation in their wines, thinking about some wines from the Jura, thinking about styles of sherry and fortified wines. But we'll talk about those too in a second. We've talked about it enough because of some really great questions, but temperature regulation is everything right now. And the idea here is your food, which is sugar. Sugar is kind of like the basis of all of this, but it's also something that producers might want to keep in. We're thinking about Riesling specifically right now as an example. You can have a lot of sugar still be present in your wine and kill the fermentation by taking the wine off of the yeast and halting the fermentation because of temperature. Cool down your fermentation, kill your fermentation essentially, rip the wine off of the yeast, and there's no more yeast, so there's nothing to really ferment. So you can still have that residual sugar, that RS as it's called, and it will go into a dormant state. You'll have your semi-fermented wine, probably a lower alcohol because it hasn't been fermented to completion. I want to add one caveat there, which is for sparkling wines. Again, I'll talk about that in a sparkling wine champagne class, but something important to note as well. It's also important to note that different wines excel at different temperatures of fermentation. Fermentation typically can happen anywhere between like 55, 60 degrees up to 90, 95 degrees. 95 is really pushing it though. White wines typically don't want to be up at that like 80 degree spectrum though. They typically want to be at a little lower. Their temperature will be regulated on their own in a barrel, for example, and the barrel room might be kept at, let's say, 60 degrees tops because that chemical reaction is creating enough heat to produce the reaction on its own, and it will go until completion as long as it's regulated ambiently at around that 60 degrees point. The other thing I want to talk about here is kind of like what temperature will do relative to the fermentation, because it's not going to be a static temperature the whole time. A cool fermentation, something in that like 70 degree, 75 degree range, will create a cool, crispy, juicy wine. Thinking about something like a Pinot Noir. Pinot Noir will spike up for a day and then it will jump down. It will spike up to like 80, 82 degrees and then trickle down and taper down to like 70 degrees. Get the fermentation started, make that yeast activate with those sugars, and then let it ride down with the idea of letting the wine be a juicier, fruitier, aromatic expression. Whereas with something like Cabernet Sauvignon, I'm using those two examples repeatedly because they're so polar. Heat will add extraction, it'll add tannin, it'll add texture, and it'll add also ester expression. We're getting kind of the polar opposites on the spectrum of that kind of expression. And last but not least, something to mention here is malolactic fermentation, MLF, malo or ML, depending on where you went to school, I learned. Apparently they call it different things. Most reds and some whites go through malo. Chardonnay primarily, thinking about Sauvignon Blanc as well. You're converting lactic acid into malic acid, and the idea is to soften a wine, essentially. If it's not gone through malo, it's going to end up being this really raspy, harsh thing. Think about the texture of a Chardonnay against the texture of a Pinot Grigio, for example. Two very different examples, and just take that with a grain of salt, but that's kind of the textural component that we're talking about here. And this is kind of just the whole diagram of everything that I just was talking about insofar as that equation. Brief moment about sparkling wine. CO2 is king. You're talking about a base wine, something they call Vin Clair, adding tirage after primary fermentation for that base wine and creating a second fermentation. Again, not going to get too deep into it, worth mentioning, but for another class. Is it the traditional method? Are you including lees contact? Are you aging your wine before adding your dosage and going into secondary fermentation? All of these things. Then we're talking about different types of sparkling wine production. We're talking about something called charmat, which is similar to the traditional method, but it's done in large steel pressurized tanks as opposed to barrels for that still wine, and then not really doing, and then going into bottle for your secondary fermentation. And then there's the natural method. We spoke about it yesterday briefly in Shannon's champagne class, but tank fermentation like any normal wine, and then little to no barrel aging, finish it in a bottle for secondary fermentation. And then there's carbonization, which is just inoculating carbon into a wine to make it sparkly, kind of like a soda stream for wine. Fortified wines, very, very basic snapshot here. We're going to call it two methods. For all wines, you're stopping the fermentation earlier, like what I talked about regarding Riesling. It's preserving what's called RS, residual sugar, as I mentioned before. You're going to add sugar back in to ferment to dryness. You could do moutage here, which is a high-proof neutral grain spirit or neutral spirit period that'll kill the fermentation because the alcohol will be high enough to kill the yeasts from continuing to activate with sugar. It's going to retain that RS, that residual sugar that's still there, but the yeast will be dead, so nothing can ferment. Thinking about something like, there's a great example of fortified wine. In this case, it's ratafia. We see it in various regions in Champagne, Burgundy, and Italy, but that's a great example of a wine that has been killed mid-fermentation, has RS, residual sugar, and then it's added in with brandy of typically the grape itself. It's a fortified wine, higher in alcohol, but still retaining its sugar. And then you can do something that's more cold stabilization, temperature reliant, as we spoke about a minute ago, to kill the yeast, to kill the fermentation, stop it, or you can do cold stabilization, add CO2, and then add SO2 to protect from secondary fermentation. Same deal of creating a sweet wine, not fortified in the same way as you might be thinking about fortifying something with brandy, but killing with temperature instead, and then separating. Just a brief mention for like the brut spectrum relative to champagne, based off of how much dosage you're adding back into the wine. It's going to have anywhere below 0.5 grams of sugar all the way up to over 8.5 grams of sugar, with the idea of making your wine be a sweeter or less sweet expression of a wine. I'll talk about this again in the champagne class, but it's a little variable, with some wines being labeled as one thing, even though the dosage or the sugar that's involved in that secondary fermentation is quite low. It's variable, so I'll put a pin in that one for now. I mentioned something earlier called cold soaking, and there's also something called carbonic maceration. Cold soaking is really this idea of taking the wine initially that has, or the grapes that have just been pressed or crushed, excuse me, that are in a bin, and putting a bunch of dry ice on top. So last but not least, well, penultimate slide here, barrel aging. This is something that I learned is incredibly important to some winemakers and can be a deep, deep rabbit hole. It's also a part of this industry that has like its own world that I learned about while living out in California. But the idea here is to impart desired characteristics for the wine. So whites, shorter time in barrel for the most part, whereas red wines, they age for quite a long time. White wines, for the most part, they're fermenting in barrel. If you're talking about Chardonnay and Sauvignon Blanc, other things like Riesling or Chenin Blanc, they're not going to be aged in barrel, typically. There are some weird exceptions. But the idea here is to impart some sort of spice character or slow oxygen in addition to your wine. The idea there is that wood is a porous thing, and depending on how much toast you have on the barrel itself, that will impart different identities of the wood itself. So we're talking about a forest and a type of wood. Maybe it's a different country, maybe it's a different region, maybe it's one adjacent town to another adjacent town. That wood is all going to look very different. And if you toast it from a high toast, so really charred, to really lightly toasted, you're going to get different expressions of that wood. And it's kind of like we're growing grapes in different places. It's a Cabernet from one region against a Cabernet from another region. It's going to express itself differently based off of where it's from. Another tool a winemaker can throw at a grape or at a wine in order to affect the final product. It also really matters whether or not the wood has been used or whether it's new. Newer wood will be more spicy. It will be more of that kind of clove, cinnamon, baking spices identity. The wood is also more porous too. So you're thinking about a liquid that's able to trickle into those little cracks and crevices into a barrel. Against a used barrel, those pores are already filled. They're saturated, they're expanded based off of it previously having been used. Barrel size matters here too because surface area will affect everything here. Sometimes you have a demijohn. It's one of those tiny little barrels. A lot more surface area that you're dealing with relative to the volume that's there. Earlier you saw that punch-in. That punch-in's a giant barrel, probably like this big to here. And the idea there is less surface area relative to volume, less affectation or effect of the wood on the final product. Something worth mentioning is oak chips. So if barrels typically are quite expensive, if something's in a tank, you throw a bunch of oak chips into it and it will start imparting the oak identity into the wine, and then you just what's called rack the wine off of the lees or off of the wood chips. You can rack a wine off of lees too. I'll talk about that in a sec. But the idea is just imparting the character of the oak chips onto the wine. And then separating. Steel and concrete, amphora, clay pots, that is really neutral fermentation vessels, not going to be imparting oxygen. That 00 wine, that pretty reductive style wine, they'll use typically concrete or amphora, sometimes steel. Things like Riesling and Chenin Blanc, as I mentioned before, also will ferment in steel against barrels. And then we're talking also about regional aging requirements. Places like Brunello have some of the most strict aging requirements in the world, and then you have your typical VDF, Vin de France, that has very little regulation about how much time a wine needs to or can or should spend in barrel, and it's very appellation dependent. But we'll talk about that more in kind of the regional specific classes. Now, you'll recall I mentioned lees a minute ago, and that's where bâtonnage comes in. Bâtonnage is stirring of the lees in the barrel with the idea of integrating the texture, like furthering the texture of the wine by way of stirring the lees, because lees also impart texture onto the wine after they've been spent up, that is. Now, at the very end of barrel aging, we have all that dirt, all those lees at the bottom of your barrel. Maybe it's at the bottom of the tank, and we don't want fermentation to possibly continue. So what are we going to do? We're going to do something called racking. You're going to stick a pipe into a barrel. You're going to suck all of the wine out of the barrel and put it into a tank so that it's ready to go to a bottle, and you're going to separate the wine off the lees. That's racking for the most part. There are some caveats to that in a 201 class, for example, like if there's a stuck fermentation or something like that, but I'll talk about that another time. Last but not least, we're at the final part. We're cold stabilizing, we're killing the fermentation because it's now cold. We're racking the wine off the lees, and we're fining or filtering the wine at this point. So fining and filtering is a practice that sometimes can strangely be controversial because of vegans. There's a typical fining agent called bentonite, which uses egg white as part of its fining process, which clarifies the wine, cleans it up, but in this way it's no longer non-vegan, or it's no longer vegan, excuse me. Then you're sulfuring to protect the wine from oxidation in the bottle, and then you're going to bottle. Different closures. You can have a cork, which slowly but surely will impart a little bit of oxygen on your wine and allow for aging. You can have a Stelvin cap, a screw cap, which is like as clean of a cap as you possibly can get. No oxygen will get inside of screw cap for the most part. That's why you see a lot of there are a lot of reasons behind different regions using screw caps, but you'll see typically a lot of wines from Austria, Germany, and South Africa using screw cap for various reasons. That's another whole conversation. And then there's crown cap versus cork cap on sparkling wines that is typically a style and regional intention, but we're also talking again about aging potential for some of these wines, with the cork being used with the intention to age and impart some of those aging identities, those tertiary qualities in a wine. And that's that.